Welcome everybody to the show at 6, Boston College and the Common Good. The show at 6 features friends and members of the BC community discussing a range of issues affecting our world today, all revolving around the theme of the common good. I am Crystal Tiala, and I will be your host along with Brian tonight. In the common good, the topics include responding to the effects of COVID-19, to the enduring challenges of the marginalized, to our own resiliency and solidarity, and to the upbuilding of human dignity throughout the world. The show is based on the central insight of the common good, that is, that the resources that humanity has and needs must be shared equitably. For example, today each of us is called to promote the common good by social distancing, wearing masks, and washing our hands. These practices, like other forms of solidarity, are not only for our own good, but for the common good. At 6:40, my co-host and I will ask our guest questions from the audience. Members of the audience can pose questions before 6:40 p.m. via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Again, members of the audience can pose a question before 6:40 via the Q&A button. Please be sure to identify yourself by your name and your relationship to Boston College. Tonight, we are going to talk about the Boston College prison education system. I am joined by my co-host, Brian Fleming, who is the Associate Director for the Global Engagement here at Boston College, and he has the honor of introducing tonight's guest, Isabel Lane.
Thanks, Crystal, and good night, everybody. So yeah, I'm really excited to introduce our guest tonight, my friend, Isabel Lane. She is the Program Director for the Boston College Prison Education Program. In her current role, she works with on-campus faculty and staff to share the best of Boston College with the incarcerated students at MCI Shirley Medium. Before coming to Boston College, Isabel completed a PhD in Slavic Languages and Literatures at Yale and taught for the Bard Prison Initiative in New York. Her dissertation, Narrative Fallout, the Russian and American novel after the bomb, focuses on how nuclear weapons, power, and waste impact the form of the contemporary novel, and in turn, how those formal choices make readers think through the ethical and environmental threats posed by nuclear technologies. Her teaching and research lie at the intersection of the environmental humanities and comparative literature, and her related commitments to social and environmental justice and the analysis of culture and verbal expression extended to nearly all areas of her life. She derives particular pleasure from interdisciplinary collaboration and loves to work with scientists, mathematicians, and really anyone who wants to brainstorm with her to further a holistic version of the liberal arts. And what I think is a testament to how lucky we are to have her, a student once wrote about her Soviet literature and ecology class, Professor Lane doesn't force conclusions, she tends her garden. And Isabel says she can't think of any better way to describe how she hopes to be as a teacher and a scholar. Welcome, Isabel. We're really excited to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So I know the prison education program at Boston College is pretty new. I think only about a year old now. And I saw it when it was advertised and got started, but I don't think our community knows very much about how it started. What brings you to this work? I think everyone will want to know. And how does it work? And how and why are you involved in this program?
Thanks, Crystal. Well, I think this is obviously a fitting place to start, and it's sort of a three-part question. So I'm afraid that my first answer will be probably the longest. But so I'll start by talking, I think, a little bit about how I got into this work, because that will bridge into both, I think, the philosophy for college and prison in general, but then also for our program and my role within it and how it operates. And I'm just really, first of all, I'm so excited to have the opportunity to talk with both of you tonight and to have the opportunity to tell the Boston College community and wider community about the program, because I think not only is it a fantastic expression of many of BC's values, but it also should be really fun to talk about. So how I got into it, I mean, I think your question gets at this, something that raises a lot of eyebrows when I'm asked what my background is, when people hear I teach and work with prisons. You know, Russian literature does have a lot of fantastic literature about prisons, but I hadn't done any work on it or surrounding it in graduate school, and I still don't. But I do think that, you know, when I was reflecting, getting this job, starting this job, and thinking about how I got into this work more broadly, I think two books that I read in high school and junior high came to mind: Sister Helen Prejean's Dead Man Walking and Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. And these are two books that are really differently about justice and about prisons and really about mercy. But I think that this informed and kind of shaped some of the ways in which I was open to this kind of work. At the end of grad school, when I ended up taking an adjunct teaching position for the Bard Prison Initiative. And there I taught, as you said, Soviet literature and ecology. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But also a first-year writing seminar about Anna Karenina and women's female writers responding to that novel. But I think that the things that really stand out to me about Dead Man Walking and The Brothers Karamazov are that they're really both books about how all human beings are worthy of a second chance and have the potential for growth and change. Prejean's book is a true account of working with an incarcerated man on death row, and Dostoevsky's novel has a lot to do with the jury system and justice. But I think even deeper than that, it's really not just about how everyone is worthy of a second chance, which I do believe, but also it's that, and I think this came up in last week's webinar about, other webinar about prisons, but, you know, a program like ours really believes that someone's worst action, the worst thing they ever did in their life, doesn't define them as a person. But I think even beyond that, it not only doesn't define them, but it's never the whole story of that person. People are infinitely complex, and I'd say that that's what drew me to teaching in prisons, and specifically teaching college literature in prisons. In my course on Soviet literature and ecology for the Bard Prison Initiative, I think what really solidified this desire I had to keep teaching in prison was my students' just absolute brilliance and also resilience. I think that there's something about college and prison. You know, many people think that this is charity or service, and in some ways, you know, there are intersections between those things, but they also think that it's a gift to the incarcerated students. Of course, an education is a gift, but it's also something really difficult. You know, it's something that students undertake both on BC's campus and if they're taking college courses in a prison. You're really risking a lot by enrolling in college. And I had a former student once say to me that, you know, in some ways, going to prison is the ultimate failure. And I think that it would be incredibly easy for a student or for an incarcerated person to decide that they weren't really willing or interested in enrolling in college, which is all about being challenged, failing at something, overcoming that failure, but really taking risks, taking intellectual risks. So that was something that just deeply inspired me about my students. And so when Boston College announced that they were hiring for someone to not only lead this BC prison education program, but to really shape it and also teach in it, I was incredibly excited. So, and perhaps I'm getting a little ahead of myself by talking about the students before I even talk about how this program came to be and how it works. But I think that based on my biography that I gave to Brian is maybe sort of my style. So this program came into being through the partnership between the Consortium for the Liberal Arts in Prison, Bard Prison Initiative, and Boston College. Boston College received an anonymous donation to give us the seed money to start this program. And with a lot of enthusiasm and leadership from Provost David Quigley, this program got started quite quickly, especially within the college and prison world. So I was hired last July. We admitted our first cohort of 16 men at MCI Shirley Medium into a bachelor's degree program. And that degree is going to be granted through the Woods College of Advancing Studies. And so far, the students are taking classes from the BC core curriculum and that are taught mostly by BC faculty, or all by people associated with Boston College. And let's see, what did I leave out of that? I have a tendency to leave out really important things from descriptions of the program. So feel free to ask me if I've forgotten something that you know I should have said.
How does the admissions process work? So
it's a bit of an unusual admissions process, at least compared to what happens on BC's campus. So we had over 100 applicants for this first round of admissions. And the only requirement for application is that you have a GED or a high school diploma and that you want to apply. So we administer a sort of exam. It's a written essay response where students are given several prompts, usually just a passage from some sort of text, and they're asked to write in an open-ended way for 2 hours about it. And that's the first round. The admissions committee of BC faculty and staff review those essays really carefully. And they look primarily for things like intellectual curiosity and openness to learning and to critique, and just a real thoughtfulness in a student's writing. And then the next round is an interview where the students selected for an interview sit down with two BC faculty or staff and have a conversation that's judged on many of those same qualities. And as I said, from that 100 applicants, we ended up with only 16. So it's a highly competitive process.
Yeah, that's great. How many BC faculty are involved so far? And can you give us a little bit more detail about some of the courses that you and they are offering in the program?
Absolutely. So the first semester of coursework we had was fall 2019. And we offered 3 courses, which is full-time coursework, and really dove these students head first. I guess they decided to dive, but they dove head first into these 3 courses: Intro to College Mathematics, Philosophy Core, and first year writing. And the second semester, the students took a history core course that was part of the globalization sequence, God, Self, and Society, which should be a familiar course title to many BC community members. So that fulfilled their theology core requirement. And then I taught a literature core course on that centered on Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground and went through several other things to end with Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And then this coming semester, we hope that we will be offering 3 more courses, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about COVID later, but for the time being, we have to halt admissions or pause admissions. We would have liked to admit a second cohort this summer, but the prison is currently closed to volunteers, and the prison is taking many different measures to impose social distancing. So larger class sizes aren't really an ideal situation either for BC or the DOC right now.
I know, as I've been teaching for a lot of years, and I'm very familiar with what it's like to sit in a Boston College classroom with students, you know, on campus. But I bet a lot of people are really curious to know what it's like to be in a classroom inside the facility. I mean, and I know there are things about you can't talk about the facility, but I'm really curious about your interaction with the students. What is that relationship with your students like? You know, is it just like being in a BC classroom, or is it different somehow? I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's in a way, it's hard for me to answer that question because I haven't taught any courses on BC's campus yet. So I am really curious how that will compare. But when I first taught for the Bard Prison Initiative, I was teaching a course at Yale on, I think, Mondays and Wednesdays, and then at a women's prison on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So I had that strong juxtaposition. And my students were often really curious how they compared to Yale students. So I think you're on the same track as they would be. But I think I can only speak to my experience, of course. And I always wish in situations like this that we could hear from the students as well, and hear how it feels to them to be in the classroom. Although I do have some sense of that and how important it is to them. But I think to me the best example is actually not from MCI Shirley, but just from my first experience teaching in a men's prison. After I had already taught at a women's prison for a semester, I taught the same course called Soviet Literature and Ecology at a men's. And to me, this is a pretty good encapsulation of some of the maybe even just misunderstandings and misapprehensions that people have about prison and college and prison. But I was extremely nervous on my first day. And on my first day teaching at the women's prison, one of my students came in, and the first thing she said to me was, "No one here knows what Soviet literature is or what ecology is, and everyone is afraid of your class." And we came to really, I certainly hope they came away with an understanding of both of those things, but we also really built a lot of common ground and understanding, and they came to really quite like Soviet literature. But I was nervous for that reason, because I knew that this topic was really unusual. But I was also nervous because I walked into this classroom, and at the time I was 29 years old, and I could see very quickly that every single one of my students, maybe with the exception of one, was at least 10 years older than I was. And I walked into that classroom and I just thought, oh no, they're not going to take me seriously. I was really, I wasn't intimidated because it was a prison. I was intimidated because I was a young woman and I was going in there trying to teach a college class and gain respect. And, to me, that was one of the best experiences I really had, because, by the end of the class, well, very, very early on in the class, it became clear that they had nothing but respect for me. And they were very willing to listen to me as an expert in my field. But, you know, on the last day of class, we had a really nice reflection back on that first day. And the student said, "Oh yeah, of course we thought you were afraid. You know, it was clear to us that you were nervous, but we just assumed you were afraid of us. You know, we're prisoners. You know, we're convicts." And, you know, to me, that's really partly at the heart of this, you know, the philosophy of this program is that, you know, the second you enter a classroom and you treat people like students, they become students. And my students were tickled pink that I hadn't been afraid of them and that I, in fact, had been really intimidated by them. But to me, that just really speaks to the seriousness of a college and prison program. You know, I was treating them like students and they were treating me like a professor. And so you know, it became that way.
Nice.
Yeah. So a couple of things you said there sort of piqued my interest. So as a sociolinguist, you know, I'm always drawn to language and the power that words can have. And of course, you know, saying that language can be very powerful is true in general, but many of us don't always fully appreciate or understand the power that certain words can carry, especially with respect to marginalized populations. You know, they can be uplifting, but they can also be really dehumanizing. And so my question is, can you tell us a little bit about the language of incarceration, especially the kinds of language and terminology that you and your students use when talking with and about them?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, I'm glad to get that question from, you know, from a sociolinguist, and of course, in many ways, I feel unqualified to answer it. But I think that, you know, there are a couple of ways I would think about it. I mean, first, I will begin with the caveat that I don't have the lived experience of incarceration. And so I think it's incredibly important to defer to people who are referred to by, you know, using different kinds of language of incarceration, and to people who are affected by the criminal justice system, you know, on their own terms. So I can speak to what I have experienced, and also I think maybe do exactly what you did and rely on my own expertise as a literature scholar. But, you know, what comes to mind is that in my class this semester, we actually had a pretty usefully parallel situation. So we began, as I said, by reading Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. And the first line of that novel is, "I am a sick man, I am a wicked man." And so as a teacher, when I teach close reading, I often, especially to people who have really never encountered it before, I often ask students to rewrite the sentence in different words or using different syntax. Because, you know, there's something about, there's something about the study of literature as an academic discipline that feels like it's going to be very easy. And in fact, I've gotten some complaints that I'm a little too tough because literature is supposed to be easy. But I do, this was a really interesting moment in class because I asked the students to read the line a couple of times and to think about what it would mean if the sentence read, "I am sick, I am wicked," rather than "I'm a sick man, I'm a wicked man." And the students started to point out that the word "man" was repeated in that paragraph over and over, in this way that it started to feel significant, and it started to feel like it was saying something about the narrator's humanity. And so I would connect that to this language of incarceration in the same way, that it's really about humanity. It's about what's often referred to as people first language. So, as I've read about this and talked to people, I found this quote from an activist named Eddie Ellis, who wrote an open letter that kind of defined thinking on this. He himself was formerly incarcerated, and the letter is called An Open Letter to Our Friends on the Question of Language. And he wrote, "Calling me an inmate, convict, prisoner, felon, or offender indicates a lack of understanding of who I am, but more importantly, what I can be. I can be and am much more than an ex-con or an ex-offender or an ex-felon." And so I guess to go back to terminology, you know, people tend to prefer, incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated people tend to prefer to be referred to the way I just described. Inmate is fairly institutionalized language, and incarcerated person emphasizes that not only that person is a person, but also that there's something of a temporary state of being to it. You might be formerly incarcerated for the rest of your life, but that's not the same as, you know, being an ex-con for the rest of your life. And as Ellis says, it really leaves open these possibilities for people. And when you limit people by calling them something like an offender or an inmate, I think the worst thing that it can do, although people feel very differently about this, but I think the worst thing that it can do is just limit someone's imagination for themselves. And, you know, in many ways, that's what our program is really trying to work against. And I think, you know, one more point to that, you know, with one thing I noticed when I was thinking about the phrase felon versus someone who has committed a felony, you know, I think that's another one of these literary ways that if you rewrite the sentence, it becomes clear that a felon is a bad, you know, is easy to think of as a bad person, is easy to dehumanize, and someone who has committed a felony, the emphasis is on the someone, and I think leaves a lot of room and openness to their potential to change and be something different.
Thank you.
That is, yeah, that's really good. Building a bit on that even more, you know, in my experience in the prison system as a volunteer, I've seen how incarcerated persons become very dehumanized just by the system that they're in, you know, how they're treated, that they're a number, you know, just everything about that is dehumanizing. And, you know, we're also having a lot of conversations about race in this day and age, and ways that we as teachers can deal with racial issues and the way we treat our students with more equity. So perhaps building, I mean, clearly you are a person, you know, you talk about your students as students, which is great, you know, really humanizing them. And I know how much they must appreciate that. Are there other things, you know, within your program that that you do that, you know, throughout the whole process that brings a sense of equity, or brings a sense of humanizing them? You know, can you just kind of expand on that a little bit more?
Well, you know, I think it's in a way that question is so, I mean, it's at the absolute heart of what my position is really creating an inclusive, hopefully really safe feeling space where these students can focus on what they are meant to focus on in the classroom, which is school. But I think, you know, in terms of race and prison and equity, there are a couple of ways to think about how college and prison, or higher ed and prison, really enters that conversation. I mean, first of all, I think it should always be informed by the racial disparities within prison systems. And how that exactly happens, in some ways really needs to be, again, defined by those people with lived experience. And I think one of the ways that we can combat inequality in higher ed and within college and prison programs is really to listen to the incarcerated students and the formerly incarcerated students, and really give their voice amplification. But, you know, one of the ways that I think that our program, and I hope that our program really is a space of equity and safety, is that, you know, I think prisons tend to be very racially divided, and our student population is drawn, you know, is usually reflects what the racial breakdown within a prison is. But there are many ways in which, you know, and last week the podcast Ear Hustle was mentioned, and there's a very interesting episode about how in California the racial divides in prison, I think, are a little more extreme than in Massachusetts. But how playing Dungeons and Dragons, for example, was one of the few spaces where races were like out in the yard, and just kind of people of different races were mixing. But I think that is one thing that our classroom provides is, you know, it doesn't matter who you hang out with outside of the classroom. When you're in class, these are your classmates, these are your colleagues. And sometimes really difficult things arise. You know, my literature core course this year began with a Russian literary novella and ended with a novel by a Black American. And my students, when we first began Invisible Man, were really upset, several of them, that there was this suggestion that in order for an African-American author to be taken seriously, he needed to mimic a white or European tradition. And I thought that was a really excellent moment where people in the classroom felt uncomfortable and they had to really talk about it. It's a very diverse space. You know, I'm the only woman in the classroom, but otherwise it's about as diverse as you could imagine. And I think one of the really satisfying things for me about that particular debate was that same student then took that frustration, the student who was most passionate about the problem with Ellison potentially drawing from Dostoevsky, was that he then created a theory out of it. And he wrote a really beautiful response paper about how it wasn't influence, it was juxtaposition.
Well, so maybe can I follow up a little bit on that? So you talked about Ear Hustle a little bit. And on one episode of the podcast, which is, for folks who might not know, it's a podcast about daily life in San Quentin State Prison in California. And the producers in this particular episode that I'm thinking of took some questions that listeners had sent in via postcard. And one of the questions was, if you can change one thing about prison, what would it be? And so, of course, as you can imagine, they got a lot of really interesting questions out in the yard. But one in particular fits, I think, really well with the question that Crystal just asked and what you were just talking about. And this one particular response was actually from one of the COs who said that if he could change one thing about prison, it would be take the race card out. And just as you alluded to, they talked about how it was pretty segregated inside on an unofficial level. And they gave the cafeteria and who sat with whom as one of those examples. And so my question is, I wonder, do you think the BC Prison Education Program classroom has any other kinds of equalizing effects in regard to these issues?
I think that that is the goal. That is absolutely the goal. I think no matter what, these, it would be dishonest, of course, to say that we can solve any particular problem with the college classroom. But I think that one thing that we do beautifully, or that the students do beautifully, is really model having these difficult conversations. And people always ask me if you need any special qualifications or qualities to teach a college course in prison, and I usually say no, which I think is largely true. But your question makes me think. One thing as a faculty member you do need to do is be able to lean into those conversations, because I have to be aware that I am a white female professor coming into a space with people who mostly don't share my same background. And I think in order to be a really effective teacher, I need to be able to take the challenges they offer. For example, that I've designed my syllabus badly by putting Dostoevsky and Ralph Ellison together, and let them and make that a conversation instead of a point of defense.
Yeah. Cool. Crystal, you wanna go next?
Sure. We're debating which questions. I know the time is closing in on us, so we're kind of looking at which other questions we have to get in here. And just a reminder to everybody out there, submit your questions to the Q&A button if you have questions for us. We'll be taking them shortly. But COVID-19, we alluded to it earlier, it's a big thing. And I know it's we've heard in the news how it's impacting prisons so much. So how does it impact your students? Do you know what's going on in there? Are you just excluded from that? What's happening with the program? What can you tell us?
Well, typically the only correspondence that a college and prison program would really have with its students would be kind of logistical things, like about reentry and upcoming parole hearings. But in this particular case, when COVID-19 shuttered the prisons to outside volunteers, it became our only means of communicating with the students through the mail. Most prisons across the country, I've found very few through my research that really have much technological capability right now, but Massachusetts does not have internet accessible, any sort of internet access for the students. So I became very adept at using the U.S. Postal Service, and I made many trips to my office, not quite in the dead of night, but trying to not disturb anyone else who might be there, to pick up my mail from the students. So the way I've been in contact with them has primarily been as a means of continuing our academic conversations. So as a teacher, I tried to help the students finish out their semester, which was interrupted. And as an administrator, I've tried to send in weekly newsletters. So those include updates about the program, updates from Boston College about the Boston College community, and information about COVID and about COVID cases in Massachusetts. And then also what I've been titling Spotlight on the Liberal Arts. So I've tried to engage students that way. Biology professor Tom Childs gave me to send in a short article on microorganisms. Cherie McGill, who taught philosophy for us, provided a short reading on Stoicism. And Elizabeth Graver in the English department provided a creative writing prompt. And you know, I'll just say I've gotten so much mail that I literally had to buy myself a letter opener. So that says something.
I love it. I love it.
Great.
That correspondence must mean so much to you, clearly, by hearing you talk about it, but also to your students. So, we've got a lot of, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I do think, I will say, just from what I hear from them, they are so grateful to be included in the Boston College community, even just in the way I write about them in these newsletters. You know, they're really proud to be BC students.
Good.
And I think it's safe to say if people are interested, teachers in Boston College are interested in getting involved, they should probably contact you and talk to you about that idea too, right?
Absolutely. So there are a variety of ways that you can get involved, but I would say, given our shortness on time, just email me. So Brian is going to share a few little bits of, a few links and a few pieces of information about tutoring organizations and other mentoring programs that you could get in touch with about working with incarcerated students. And then if you're interested in teaching or interested in getting more information or possibly contributing to the program, we do fundraise and solicit donations. So if you're interested in that, you can email me. And if you're interested in teaching, you can fill out this Google form that has been shared in the chat.
Cool.
Yes.
Brian, anything else you wanted to add there?
Well, just looking at the time, one quick question before we get to the Q&A. So really quickly, can you describe sort of what your hopes are for the program?
So I think I said it in my biography, really. I think of myself primarily as a scholar and a teacher, and rather than, someone who specifically does prison education. And so really what I'm interested in doing is taking the fantastic Boston College education and student experience, and knowing that there are many limitations, translate that the best I can to MCI Shirley and beyond. And really my hopes are that I will continue to work with the incarcerated students and formerly incarcerated people in general to get feedback on where this program should go, and then work with the already incredible faculty and staff at BC who have been really helping to shape this program.
We are getting some amazing questions, so let's get to it now. We have a question from Takahito Kamata, a professor at Sophia University in Tokyo, Japan. Thank you for joining us. In comparison with students at ordinary higher education institutions, incarcerated students have limited learning opportunities in terms of co-curricular learning and other activities. What kind of teaching methodology, approach, or pedagogy has been effective to cultivate intellectual curiosity of the incarcerated students through the limited teaching and learning opportunities? Great question. Tough question.
Yeah, great question, tough question. So I mean, of course, I have no idea what really went into the decision to hire me, but I do think that it had something to do with the fact that, I really think of myself as a lifelong learner, and, I try to bring that to the prison education program and just show students that, education is really about figuring out how to be fully human. It's about figuring out who you are. And that's true for an 18-year-old, a 7-year-old, or, a 45-year-old. And so I think really, and then in terms of practical things, I in terms of less practical things, I try to just bring that general attitude and spirit to the program. Practically, we really try not to deviate in our pedagogy from what someone would do on campus. When I'm onboarding new faculty members, I tell them, that they can expect to teach their classes as they would on campus. My caveat is usually that you will get more difficult questions than you would on in a typical college classroom. I don't find that intellectual curiosity is something I need to cultivate terribly aggressively, that is already there. And that really it's about trying to provide students with the tools and the language that they may not have yet had access to really put into words what they're thinking, what their already great ideas are, and how to find the information that they're seeking. So in that way, it's really, research and academic research more broadly is, I think, a really useful tool for any incarcerated person.
So there are a lot of questions about people wanting to get involved. So here's a quick logistical question. One is, do faculty teaching in the program get course releases for teaching as part of that? And then also related, can graduate students participate as instructors for this program, or is it limited only to faculty members?
Yes, so the first question, we don't currently provide course releases unless that's something that you work out with your department. But I do want to stress that this is a paid position. So what we do actually do is have what is more or less equivalent to an overload teaching stipend. And, I think that this is important both in terms of compensating the academic labor that goes into teaching a course, but also because, these students are students. I feel like I keep saying that same thing, but I think it's important in their self-conception and in the world's conception of the program that this is not something we expect people to do for free. So that's part of it. And then graduate students are absolutely welcome to contact me about teaching in the program. As long as you're eligible to teach on campus, you are eligible to teach in our program.
So your Aunt Teresa, I love it when family members weigh in, has asked a question. The Bard College in the prison program had the students in the prison helping each other study, etc. Do the students at the BC program have the ability to work together outside of the classroom?
Yeah, that's a really important part of college in prison, because if you think about us, about how much time a faculty member or even director spends in a prison, it's a fraction of the time that the students are together. So we try to cultivate a space where students, like a physical space, where students can come together and study, but it's also an issue of just trying to create a community of students where they want to help each other. And I already see that happening. I already see students suggesting that people they know apply, getting tutoring help from people who aren't in our program, actually. So there was someone tutoring some of our students in math who had a math degree but was not enrolled with BC PEP.
Nice.
Yeah.
So this is a good question. I think you might have touched on it very briefly, but let's talk about it just in a little bit more depth. Is this a degree granting program? And how is it different than other college classes offered inside other facilities?
Yeah, see, this is what I meant when I said I was positive I was leaving out some very important information. Yes, these students are bachelor's degree seeking students. So we actually just received accreditation from the New England Commission for Higher Education to actually grant the degree. This isn't terribly important this very moment because the students won't be graduating for several years, but this is a BA degree through the Woods College. And in terms of how classes are different, from maybe other programs in this state and beyond. You know, I think the way it should work, at least, is that, you know, Bard College has their own very specific courses and very specific emphases that they then bring to their prison program. And I think the same is exactly true for BC. You know, we try really to emphasize the core curriculum. And in fact, I just, in terms of extracurricular activities, I just sent in copies of the first year convocation book, Bruce Springsteen's autobiography, and the reading guide, so that students can participate in something that's uniquely BC.
I think one of the questions, you probably partly answered this with what you just said, but Mark Holden asked, why focus on liberal arts programming instead of a skill-based program?
Well, I think this is always a central question to this conversation. My answer would be, I think there absolutely should be skill-based programs and vocational training, and to some degree there are those programs in Massachusetts prisons. But, you know, that isn't what Boston College really does. Boston College, of course, offers all sorts of classes and programs that are focused on leading their students to a career. But I think that the idea is we do what we do best, and that is the liberal arts. And then also, I think philosophically, one thing that I love about the idea behind college and prison is that it takes it as its central principle that everyone is deserving of a really high quality education. I think it certainly makes a great case for the liberal arts teaching these skills, because, you know, the skills that are needed in the, you know, in the real world. But because a lot of students who graduate from these programs go on to do fantastic things. But at the same time, it really is, if there's I hate to use the word experimental, but if there's an experimental component or a kind of idealistic component to this program, it's that, you know, why are these students less deserving of or less in need of the liberal arts than really anyone else?
I'm going to go back to a question we had earlier that we kind of skipped over for time. What do you find are the challenges with coordinating and implementing this program? And what, if anything, could our BC community do to help make things a little less challenging for you?
Oh, well, thank you for that lovely question and offer, I think. You know, I really think, of course, there are always going to be challenges when it comes to creating a college where there wasn't one. And I think, of course, this isn't the same thing, but before I came to BC, I was doing some outdoor teaching that involved, you know, teaching a course on a farm and doing experiential activities. And it took more planning and coordination because it wasn't a college classroom. So I think that in that way, that problem is real, but not necessarily one that can be solved. I think the most important thing that the BC community can do is provide the kinds of intellectual and community supports that they really have already been doing or been providing. You know, for example, faculty members who are willing to drive out to MCI Shirley. It's a 50-minute drive, and it's not nearly as close as BC probably is to where they live, although not necessarily.
Depends on where you live, yeah.
Yeah, it depends on where you live. But I think I think the other thing you need to teach college in prison or run a college in prison program is flexibility and ability to roll with the punches. So this is less something that the community can do, although certainly I think a tolerance for the need to do those things is helpful. But really just the spirit of innovation and of flexibility to actually enact a really high quality program.
I have one question's been weighing on my mind. I have to ask, what happens to your students if they are released before they finish the program?
So that's something that the BC PEP program is putting a lot of thought and work into. I think that in part it depends. I've been doing a lot of research on what other programs do, other college and prison, but also simply reentry organizations. But it's an area that our program would really like to expand, because I think it's incredibly important for BC PEP and for the people behind it that we find ways for students to finish their degrees, whether that's at BC, at a community college to earn an associate's, or at a state school, or at one of the other universities in the area. I think the major thing behind it is that we want to give students the most options possible. My dream would be that we have students at Harvard, we have students in graduate school, and we have students really just pursuing whatever it is they're interested in, and attending a school that that really speaks to them and meets their needs.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Every time I talk to you about your work, I am so inspired. Your passion just really comes through, and once again, it's done it tonight. So thank you so much for being with us.
Agreed. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope you're going to get a lot of inquiries and Google form submissions very soon.
Send them my way.
Good. So before we close, I'm going to talk a little bit about the next episode. So the next episode is entitled Facing Death and the Zombies, Resiliency Part 3, I know. And that features Amy Victoria Adkins Jones, who is an assistant professor of theology. And it's going to be hosted by Régine Jean Charles, who is an assistant professor of French, and Bert Howell, who is the executive director of Intersections here at BC. So we hope you'll join us. Do remember that you do need to register for each segment that you want to attend. And as you know, by doing it tonight, you know that it's very brief and it's also very free. But each segment does have a different webinar link. So please check out our website at bc.edu/show@6. That's SHOWAT with the number 6. And see the next segments. We've got a good lineup to finish out the summer. And then while you're there, you can also check out all of the previous shows in the archives tab. So we hope to see you then.
Thank you
and
all.
With that, thanks again. Be well, stay safe, and good night from Boston College. Bye, everybody.